Our sermon text for this morning is Job 16. We've been preaching through the entire book of Job. And as you know, in the first couple of chapters, we ran into Job's problems and his misery when storms and raiders came and took his family and all his possessions, which began a series of cycles in which Job is confronted by his three friends. And we've looked through the first cycle in which Job gave an answer, and then Eliphaz spoke, and then Job gave an answer to that, and Bildad spoke, and then Zophar spoke, and Job gave an answer to that. And the gist of this conversation has been that the friends believe in a doctrine of retribution, that because Job is suffering, he must have sinned. And we know that's not true. And because Job is called blameless in chapter 1 and throughout. And Job is arguing that he is innocent of what his friends accuse him of. And so his friends keep harping at this doctrine of retribution, and Job keeps proclaiming his innocence. And last week we came to the second cycle in which Job spoke first, sort of as a transition from the first cycle to the second cycle. And then last week in chapter 15, Eliphaz spoke again, beginning the second cycle. And this morning we're going to look at chapter 16, and next week chapter 17, in which Job responds to the second speech of Eliphaz. So that's where we are this morning, Job chapter 16, and we'll be looking at verses 1 through 22. Job 16, verse 1. But Job answered and said, I have oftentimes heard such things. Miserable comforters are ye all. Shall there be none end of words of wind, or what maketh thee bold so to answer? I could also speak as ye do, but would God your soul were in my soul's stead. I could keep you company in speaking and shake mine head at you. But I would strengthen you with my mouth, and the comfort of my lips should assuage your sorrow. Though I speak, my sorrow cannot be assuaged. Though I cease, what release have I? But now he maketh me weary. O God, thou hast made all my congregation desolate, and hast made me full of wrinkles, which is a witness thereof, and my leanness riseth up in me, testifying the same in my face. His wrath hath torn me, and he hateth me, and gnasheth upon me with his teeth. Mine enemy hath sharpened his eyes against me. They have opened their mouths upon me, and smitten me on the cheek in reproach. They gathered themselves together against me. God hath delivered me to the unjust, and hath made me to turn out of the way by the hands of the wicked. I was in wealth, but he hath brought me to naught. He hath taken me by the neck and beaten me, and set me as a mark for himself. His archers compass me round about. He cutteth my reins, and doth not spare, and poureth my gall upon the ground. He hath broken me with one breaking upon another, and runneth upon me like a giant. I have sewed a sackcloth upon my skin, and have abased mine horn unto the dust. My face is withered with weeping, and the shadow of death is upon mine eyes. Though there be no wickedness in mine hands, and my prayer be pure. O earth, cover not thou my blood, and let my crying find no place. For lo, now my witness is in the heaven, and my record is on high. My friends speak eloquently against me, but mine eye poureth out tears unto God. Oh, that a man might plead with God as man with his neighbor. For the years accounted come, and I shall go the way whence I shall not return. If you'd like to follow the sermon in print, it's printed in your bulletin for you to follow. If you'd like to follow it, or you're welcome to just listen. Either way, whatever you prefer. The title of our message this morning, Job chapter 16, verses 1 to 22, Job's fifth speech, and a response to Eliphaz and his speech in chapter 15. The second cycle of speeches has begun. Eliphaz had rebuked Job, sarcastically asking if he was wiser than the ages, and whether he was privy to the secret counsel of God. Eliphaz then turned to the role of comforter in the latter part of his speech, encouraging Job that he was not like the wicked, who neither enjoy their prosperity while they're on earth, and who live in constant fear of death, and then die early and unfulfilled because they have not served their Creator. In chapters 16 and 17, here we have Job's reply. There are 4 points to our message this morning. Verses 1 to 6, Job speaks to his friends. Verses 7 through 14, Job speaks to God in a very overstated lament. In verses 15 through 17, Job laments his own suffering. And in verses 18 through 22, Job's cry as a silent witness. And now our context for this morning's text. Throughout the book of Job, there are brief references to the future coming of Christ, especially in Job's desire for a redeemer, an advocate, and an intercessor, at least one who could testify of his innocence on his behalf to the Father. In this chapter and in subsequent chapters, Job is presented as a type of Christ. Job, like Christ, has become a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. Job, like Christ, is abandoned by his friends. He, in this very chapter, is said to be smitten on the cheek in verse 10, as Christ was smitten on the cheek. Also, like Christ, the wicked gather themselves against him. Like Christ, he says he's beaten, pierced, and broken. And Job, like Christ, cries out to the Father with an innocent voice, yet is not heard. Job, as a type of Christ, will be further developed in the latter portions of the book of Job, but it really pronounces itself in this particular chapter. We come to our first point, verses 1 through 6. Job speaks to his friends. Verses 1 and 2. But Job answered and said, I have oftentimes heard such things. Miserable comforters are ye all. Job says that the words and ideas of his friends, speaking specifically of Eliphaz's last speech, and specifically of this false doctrine of retribution, is nothing that Job has not heard before. Job says, I have oftentimes heard such things. These same arguments, say Job, offer nothing. They are not new arguments, and their advice is the same thing over and over again. In this speech, Job also refers to all his friends as miserable comforters, or what we might translate, comforters of trouble. The job, as we all know, of a comforter is to minister or soothe a troubled time or a troubled mind. But instead of ministering comfort, they have only increased his trouble. They have had the opposite of effect of a comforter. Eliphaz had portrayed himself as a channel of divine consolation, calling his own words a divine encouragement. He was troubled that Job would not accept his words as the very words of God. But Job believes that his friends do not speak in the name of God. They may speak in the name of God, but they don't speak the mind of God, but trouble him with accusations against his innocence without proof. They are torturers rather than comforters to Job. Verse 3. Shall there be none end of words of wind, or what maketh thee bold so to answer? This is a verse that can be taken two different ways. Either approach amounts to the same thing. This could simply be Job offering the same criticism back to Eliphaz, as if to say, you accuse me of long-windedness and boldness to answer God, but I accuse you of the same thing. But I think it's slightly different than that. It seems to fit the context better to take these words as Job repeating Eliphaz's accusations against himself, or Job repeating the criticism of Eliphaz. In other words, in this verse, I think it's better taken that Job is summarizing Eliphaz's argument from chapter 15. It is Eliphaz, you'll remember, who in chapter 15 criticized Job with these same words. For instance, in Job 15:2, Eliphaz said to Job, shall a wise man speak words of the wind? And later in chapter 15, verse 4, he said, surely thou hast cast all fear and restrainest prayer before God. Since these words represent Eliphaz's criticism of Job as recently as the last chapter, it's probably best to take these words as Job repeating the criticism of Eliphaz against himself. So you might take it like this. It's as if Job has said, "You said, there shall be no end of words of wind, or what maketh thee bold, so to answer." But as I said, it amounts to the same. Verses 4 and 5. Job says to Eliphaz and his friends, "I could also speak as you do, but would God your soul were in my soul's stead. I could keep you company in speaking and could shake mine head at you. But I would strengthen you with my mouth, and the comfort of my lips should assuage your sorrow." Now Job says, "You criticize me for being long-winded and misrepresenting the character of God." He says, "But I could say the same about you." Job said, "I could also speak as ye do." Now, Job is their superior, at least in our book here, in interpreting the ways of God. He does have a better understanding of God's secret providence than his friends do. It must be understood that when Job claimed superiority, he was not being arrogant or claiming superior self-importance. Job simply says this to his friends because these are the words of a disappointed man who has looked to his friends for intellectual, moral, and emotional comfort and received nothing but criticism and bad advice. Furthermore, Job believes that he has been his own best comforter. All his friends can offer is the same mixture of shallow encouragement and superficial criticism. Job says that if their places were reversed, that's what he means by the line, "But would God your soul were in my soul's stead," if our places were reversed, that he would not speak to them as his friends speak to him. Job says, "I could keep you company in speaking and could shake mine head at you. Or if I was in your place, I could shake or wag my head at you, for it's not a hard thing to do to shake or wag your head at somebody." But Job says that is not what I would do. Job says, "But I would strengthen you with my mouth, and the comfort of my lips should assuage your sorrow." Job says he would use comforting words that would bring strength to weak bones. He would restore power to the man who feels powerless. For that is the role of a comforter, to bring life back to dead thoughts and power to endure to a body that desires to give up. A comforter gives a perspective that brings strength or life back to a person who feels dead and helpless. Job says, "I would have designed my words to recover the powerless, not drain them of what little power they had left." Verse 6, Job continues, "Though I speak, my sorrow cannot be assuaged. Though I cease, what release have I?" This is a lament by Job. Job asks out loud, what will be accomplished by all this talk? In other words, the first cycle is over, and I'm no closer to being comforted. Job laments that he finds no comfort in speaking or in silence. Job's experience is that trying to receive comfort by long speeches or from silence have had the same negative effect. And both have been incapable of relieving Job's suffering. Job has experimented with silence to relieve his suffering, such as when he restrained his mouth in Job chapter 2, verse 10. And he has also tried to relieve his suffering by making speeches, which he started in the 3rd chapter. But neither worked to bring him comfort. He has also experienced his friends' silence, Job chapter 2, verse 13, and also their speeches throughout the book. And neither relieved him of his suffering. Even worse, their speeches proved that their silence was insincere. Silence and speech for Job have been equally ineffectual. Job has spoken his sorrow, and he has ceased to speak. Neither have brought relief. Therefore, Job asks rhetorically, "What release have I?" We come to our second point, verses 7 through 14. Job speaks to God, verses 7 through 8. Remember, with poetry, sometimes the language is very exaggerated and seems sometimes almost blasphemous. But that's the nature of poetry, overstate. Poetry speaks from the emotions, not from the reason. Verses 7 and 8. Job speaks to God. Verse 7 and 8. But now he makes me weary. O God, thou hast made all my congregation desolate, and hast made me full of wrinkles, which is a witness thereof. And my leanness riseth up in me, testifying the same in my face. Job here now turns his attention away from criticizing his friends and laments against the perceived aggressive acts of God towards him. First, he speaks of how God has worn him out emotionally. God has taken from Job all that gave him strength, his family, his health, and any loyal friends. God has made, he says, all my congregation desolate, leaving him no one who could offer him any wisdom or encouragement. Job has grown weary and tired of life itself. Next, he speaks of how God has worn him out physically. He has been made full of wrinkles, which were prematurely caused by God's wearing his flesh away. His body has become like a skeleton. His cheeks are sunken, and his flesh runs with boils. Even worse, the leanness and lack of health in Job is being used by his friends as evidence that he has sinned and that God is displeased with him. Although Job's friends see these infirmities as witnesses of Job's sins, Job calls his infirmities as a witness to God's cruelty to him for over-punishing him in his innocence. Verse 9, Job goes on to overstate his case against God. His wrath hath torn me, and he hateth me, and gnasheth upon me with his teeth. Mine enemy hath sharpened his eyes against me. God's supposed attack on Job is here described like the attack of a wild beast. It is common in the Psalms to portray one's enemy as an animal or as a wild beast. We see that in Psalms 7 and 10 and 17 and even in chapter 22, which we'll sing shortly. The assault upon Job, according to Job, is motivated by God's anger, which we know is not true. To Job, God tears him like a lion or a wolf tears at his prey. While the animal attacks with sharp teeth, Job says that God has fixed upon him a sharp eye, eager to spy out his most minor faults and to punish him with both emotional and physical attacks. Job goes on, verse 10, they, probably those enemies he's encountered, have opened their mouths upon me and smitten me on the cheek in reproach. They gathered themselves together against me. In Job's mind, God has turned his back against his cry. And even worse, his calamity is used by his neighbors as evidence of his hypocritical sin. His neighbors believe that God hates Job, so they likewise do the same. Since God has marked Job out as a sinner in their eyes, every righteous person feels it their religious duty to take God's side by mistreating Job. The open mouth talked about here is used by animals to devour, but in this context, it signifies the devouring of Job's reputation by open mouths that speak disparagingly against Job. As you know, smiting one on the cheek is a sign of disgust and insult. Job was probably not slapped in the face, but the attitude of his friends has had the same emotional consequence. Verse 11, Job goes on, God hath delivered me to the unjust, and hath made me to turn out of the way by the hands of the wicked. While Job had hoped for deliverance from God's wrath, instead, God delivered him into the hands of the wicked. The hands of the wicked probably referred to anyone who believed that Job's suffering was the result of God's divine displeasure. Job clearly believes that their actions are directly motivated by God, and therefore looks beyond the will of humans and believes it is God that has put it in their minds to sift him. For it is God that gave them their commission. Job here blames God for the actions of his neighbors, because he says, "For God hath delivered me to the unjust." Verse 12, "I was in wealth, but he hath brought me to naught." Naught means nothing. "He hath taken me by the neck and beaten me, and set me as a mark for himself." Job here now thinks back to his former condition before his misguided belief that God was punishing him in his hostility. Whereas in verse 9, Job pictured God as a wild animal, here in verses 12 through 14, Job pictures God as a warrior. But God is not portrayed here as a noble warrior, but one who brings a whole army just to attack one man and his unsuspecting family. Once again, Job is returning to the common motif that there is a disproportionate justice between Job's crimes and God's punishment. Job here says that he was in wealth, meaning he lived an untroubled life of ease. But God has attacked Job in his mind and subdued him as a warrior defeats his enemy by taking him by the neck. The neck, of course, is the most vulnerable part of the body. And once the neck is lost in battle, the whole body is lost. It is used in the same context as in Exodus 23:27, where it says, "Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies." Here we see that God has treated Job furiously as a grown man would shake the neck of a child. God has also targeted Job, distinguishing Job from all the rest of mankind to display his power. And so Job complains that God has set me as a mark for himself, as if the blameless Job were the chiefest of all sinners. Verses 13 and 14, he goes on with the analogy of being attacked by a warrior. "His archers compass me round about. He cutteth my reins, and doth not spare, and poureth my gall upon the ground. He hath broken me with one breaking upon another, and runneth upon me like a giant." Now Job perceives God as cruel, surrounding him with archers. That's people who shoot bows and arrows from above. Each soldier is to take aim at Job's most vulnerable parts, not showing any mercy at all. Just as a hunter might aim at the kidney of a deer, the kidneys of man are here used as the center of Job's emotions. Therefore, Job says that God aims at his emotions and aims his attack against Job's affections, his most vulnerable parts. And from Job's kidney, struck by an arrow, comes gall, which is a bitter liquid. Job writes as if he were a hunted animal who has been pierced in the kidney by an arrow, and his gall, which is his bitterness, spills all over the ground. Furthermore, we learn that these supposed attacks by God are relentless, with one breaking upon another. In other words, being pierced by one arrow after another. Job now is likened to a besieged city, and God is leading the attacking forces. First, God attacks the outer walls with arrows, and then he rushes into the castle like a mighty warrior rushes upon its lone inhabitant. In every other scripture, when God rushes, it is to protect the innocent or to defeat the ungodly. But Job uses the exact reversal to criticize God. For Job, God is not a saving God. He is an attacking God who in terror attacks his own servants like a giant. Verses 15 through 17, our third point. Job further laments his suffering. Verses 15 through 17, Job says in this grisly example, "I have sewed a sackcloth upon my skin, and have abased mine horn unto the dust. My face is withered with weeping, and the shadow of death is upon mine eyes. Though there be no wickedness in mine hands, and my prayer be pure." In this very short three-line stroke, Job uses metaphors to show the assaults of God and humans upon him. Job's response to what he deems these unjustified attacks will not be to defend himself physically, but he will defend himself with words and tears, and he will argue for his disregarded rights. As you know, sackcloth is something always worn in a time of mourning. No doubt Job wore sackcloth after his children died. However, After a certain amount of time, the mourner takes off the sackcloth and returns to normal clothing. But Job says that his suffering is so extreme and continual that he might as well sew sackcloth into his skin, for he never expects to take it off until his death. We have another metaphor of a horn. The horn of an animal, as you know, Hannah speaks of a horn in Samuel, her horn dropped low, is said to droop just before its death or when it's in great sorrow, having lost a spouse. Job likens himself to a horned animal. The weariness of the body and the sadness of his soul causes him to bend low in death, like the horn of an animal. Next, Job describes his physical appearance. Job says he possesses the red and puffy face of a person who had wept for a very long time. His face is said to be withered with weeping. He no longer sees the fairer things in life. His eyes do not see mercy and beauty, but rather he sees only evil, the wicked, and the useless things that make up life. His eyes see death in every object and every event, for as the text says, the shadow of death is upon mine eyes. Interestingly here, it must be understood that Job is not grief-stricken because of the loss of his children. That's not what's bothering him the most. Or the loss of his possessions, or the loss of his friends, or due to the pain that he is in, or even due to the fact that he might soon die. Job is grief-stricken because he cannot understand what appears to be cruel assaults from God against a relatively innocent person. He says, "There be no wickedness in mine hands." It is as if he thought he knew God, and now he doesn't. He does not know how to please God and what his standing is before God, nor can he figure out what went wrong, because nothing did go wrong, or how to amend his ways, if that's what he needs to do. He cannot understand why a holy God will not defend his purity. He is lost, and God is silent. We come to our final point, verses 18 through 22. Job's cry as a silent witness. Verses 18 through 22. Job says this, "O earth, cover not thou my blood, and let my crying find no place. For lo, now my witness is in the heaven, and my record is on high. My friends speak eloquently against me, but mine eye poureth out tears unto God. Oh, that a man might plead with God as man with his neighbor. For the years accounted come, and I shall go the way whence I shall not return." Job wishes to dispute with God, but of course he tried that, and heaven remained silent. And any eventual reconciliation seems now to Job an impossible dream, if God won't answer. And since he has no allies, for his friends all mistakenly believe that they have sided with God, and since it appears that he must soon die in shame among his neighbors, Job does the last and the only thing he can think to do. He cries to heaven in such a way that maybe the reverberation of his voice can remain in heaven after he dies